Good evening, ladies. I sure hope that you made Bible study today. For those of you that didn't, you missed a great discussion time tonight. And I'm sure Vicky's class had a great discussion this morning. As we look at Lesson 3, I want you to think about something. What did we learn from last week that helped you do the lesson this week? What attributes do you remember that helped you understand better the sovereignty of God? As we looked over our lesson tonight, we looked at each one of those verses that we looked up and wrote. Again, we wrote tons of stuff this week. And we made a list of what God rules over. So as you go back and look through your verses, and as you look through them, pick out the things that it says that God rules over. I'm going to give you just a few of them. I'm sure I don't have all of them that we mentioned tonight in class. We know that God rules over one's mind. We talked about Nebuchadnezzar and how God changed his mind. God rules over our minds. No one can ward off God or stay God's hand or question him. God rules over the nations. God's plan stands. Nothing can frustrate his plans. God rules over Satan. As we talked about Job, we saw where Satan could only do to Job what God allowed him to do, and no more than that. Sometimes we give Satan more power than he actually has. God limits Satan's power. Satan can't act without permission. He had to get permission to test Job. He had to get permission to sift Peter. We looked at that a little bit tonight. And even though Satan has a lot of power, Satan is not omnipresent, omniscient, or omnipotent. We found out that God has ruler over time. He's the ruler over events in history. He's ruler over man. He even uses birds of prey to do his will. He rules over the kingdoms of the world. He places rulers and he removes them. He is ruler over wisdom, power, and knowledge. He is the one that gives wisdom and knowledge. We would like to think that we're so smart and that we can do all of that. But God is the one that ultimately gives wisdom and knowledge. He's ruler over darkness and light. We found, of course, that he's ruler over Israel and Judah. It talked about how he placed a hedge of protection around them, or he removed that hedge. We talked about he is the ruler over protection. He decides how much protection and when protection is given. He's ruler over rain and storms and plants and crops. He gives life. He's ruler over death. He wounds. He heals. He brings down. He raises up. He's ruler over the rich and the poor. He's ruler over even our criticisms, our curses. We looked at David, and when David was fleeing from Absalom, Shemaiah cursed him, and David would not allow his men to do anything to Shemaiah because he said, maybe God is cursing me. As we read the rest of the story, we know that that was not true. But we talked about how God could use criticism in our lives. Maybe when we are criticized or cursed, we should take a step back and listen to what God is saying to us and ask him, is there some truth to this? Is there something I need to change? And God may just tell us that you're being criticized because you're doing exactly what I called you to do. And so it gives us firmer convictions in what he's telling us. We looked at how God creates the light and the dark. And even in the dark, God knows what you're doing or what is happening. We talked about how we need to be aware of evil, but still be good and kind. God is still ruler, even over the good times and the bad times. We talked about how he's the ruler over authorities, whether it's our president, our senators, our mayors. He's ruler over calamities in our lives. We don't like to think about calamity and it might be from God, but sometimes it is from God. He's also ruler over stumbling blocks. And one of the things that was brought out in our lesson today by one of the other students is that even though God puts up stumbling blocks, doesn't mean that I have to be a stumbling block. So think about that this week. Are you a stumbling block? And if so, what can you do to change that so that you are not? We looked at Joseph, and I love the story of Joseph and who he is and all that he does. We looked at how he was a teenager and had the dreams that made him think that he would rule over his brothers one day. And I just imagine Joseph as a teenager being just a little bit cocky as he's telling his brothers the dreams. We see how their jealousy causes them to sell him into slavery. We see he moved from being the son, the favorite son of a rich man, to being the slave of an influential man. It must have been a great come down for Joseph. And then the things that he went through, he still followed God. He still did what was right. And God protected him. And God was with him. And his master saw that and promoted him until he was really head over the household of everything except for his master. And then we see where Joseph is accused of doing something wrong. And he did not do anything wrong. He was right and just. And yet he was thrown into prison. And then we see him again rising above being a prisoner and a slave. And these things, we sometimes think they happened overnight, but they didn't. It took years for Joseph to work his way up, for those around him to see that God was with him. But they did see that God was with him. And all this time, God is using these circumstances to grow Joseph to the point that he will be a great administrator. God shows Pharaoh what he's going to do with the famine that is to come. He gives Joseph the wisdom to translate the dreams that Pharaoh had. And then he gives him the wisdom to make a plan so that during the famine years they will have food to eat. And it preserved the life of Jacob and his sons and grandchildren. And we see God's plan even then being worked out step by step. And it was, even though it was a terrible thing for Joseph to go through, Joseph realized that God meant it for good and used it for good in his life. And we talked about Joseph and how God used it for good. And in our own lives, some of the things that we have gone through that God uses for good. Romans 8:28 and 29 says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, and for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. God causes good out of every circumstance in our life. He uses these circumstances to prepare us and to make us into the people that he wants us to be, to make us more like his Son Jesus. We talked about trials and how God uses the trials in our life, sometimes to test our faith, but most often he uses those trials to produce endurance and perseverance and steadfastness and all the things that we talked about in James 1:2-4. And through all of this, he reminds us to give thanks in all circumstance, because even when things are bad and we can give God thanks, it keeps our focus on him and what he is doing. For me, this lesson made me think about Paul and all that Paul went through. We know that he was shipwrecked, he was beaten, he was thrown into prison, and so many things happened to him that the list could go on and on. And he was persecuted, but God used him. One of the things that he reminds me most of is in 2 Corinthians 2:8-10, where he tells us about the thorn in the flesh that God had given him. And he asked God to remove that that thorn. And this is what he says about that. He said, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with the weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I am weak, I am strong. The New Living Translation puts it this way: my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. And I think many times the reason we have calamities in our lives, we have hardships, we have trials, we have things that we have to live with every day, is so that God can so that we can recognize our weaknesses and place our faith and our trust in God, study His Word, and turn to Him during those weaknesses. And then He is able to grow us and use us and make us more like Him each day. I hope you enjoyed the study this last week, and I'm looking forward to week 4. We start looking at some of those big words like predestined and foreknowledge. Study well this week, and we'll see you next Wednesday morning or Wednesday night. Thank you.